How does an administration go about spreading out and squirreling away evidence they fear could get lost with the change of government?
Well, it does a few different things. You know, you have to remember a lot of the intel on this is coming in really late. They're recognizing November, December, January, this kind of scope of this Russian campaign, and the suspicions about contacts, what these contacts between the Trump associates and Russians were. And so they're rushing to kind of take all this raw intelligence, put it into finished analyses, finished reports, and then kind of do those reports at the lowest level of classification that they could possibly do so that as many people in the government could read it. And the idea there was that, you know, you don't want to be in a situation where only so many people know it. It's much easier to contain that information. So you spread it out. And then you take that raw intel and you take the most sensitive information, the sources' names, the human intelligence names, and you put that into the deepest compartments you can find, into places where only people with intelligence clearances are going to get to it. You're not going to get political appointees looking at it, things like that. And I think that was kind of the bigger idea here, that you wanted to get this out there, and you wanted to then leave a bit of a trail of breadcrumbs, such as it is, for investigators, especially congressional investigators. One of the ways you could do that, and we were told people did, is every day there are intelligence briefings that go on. You ask to brief for specific questions. They have to come back with written answers. Those written answers are archived, and any, say, Senate investigator would know to go look at them.
Your headline is grabbing enough, and it came in as a New York Times alert on a lot of people's devices tonight. Obama administration rushed to preserve intelligence of Russian election hacking. But it's your second graph that reads so stone cold that you realize this has to be seen as at least a potential threat to this administration. American allies, including the British and the Dutch, have provided information describing meetings in European cities between Russian officials and others close to Russia's President Vladimir Putin and associates of President-elect Trump, according to 3 former American officials who requested anonymity in discussing classified intelligence. Separately, American intelligence agencies had intercepted communications of Russian officials, some of them within the Kremlin, discussing contacts with Mr. Trump's associates. It goes on from there. What happens now? Knowing about the bulk of what's there to be discovered, what is already known to some people with security clearances, how does this affect the ongoing investigations?
Look, I want to be fair to the people who were having these meetings, that what was going on in those meetings is still remarkably unclear, and nobody knows for sure. Those conversations were talking about these contacts, but what exactly they were doing with them still is not clear. And even who exactly, what the Trump people knew. Some of these Trump people were business people meeting with other business people. Unfortunately, in Russia, there are very blurry lines between who's in business, who's in intelligence. But I think the bigger point here is there are questions that need to be answered. And this is going to push for more of those answers. Because right now, the never happened, didn't see it, don't know anything about it, that just isn't lining up with what a lot of other people are telling us.
Matthew Rosenberg, one of 3 authors of tonight's breaking news in the New York Times. Matthew, along with Adam Goldman, Michael Schmidt in Washington, thank you so very much for finding time to be with us at the top of our broadcast tonight. Again, the piece is on the New York Times website. Let's bring in Chris Matthews and Andrea Mitchell. And Chris, starting with your reaction to the conversation.
Well, the way I listened to and watched, I thought our video documentation was great. It showed the whole nature of this that's been in public, the bromance, potential bromance between President Trump now, and Vladimir Putin. Sort of an obvious kind of, I like this guy, I want to get to know him more, maybe we can be best friends, that sort of thing that we picked up over the months. And then, of course, all the information basically from the New York Times we've gathered about the Russian effort from the beginning, a lot of it documented by unnamed sources, of course. What I keep seeing, David and Andrea, in my head is when we grew up with our grandmother's house, we were always putting together these puzzles. And we'd always start with the borders, because you could look for the straight lines. And you'd build it from and what we have from that opening of the program tonight is the borders. We know about the relationship potentially between President Trump and President Putin. We know about some of the communications that have gone on, but we haven't gotten really half that picture in the middle of the puzzle, which is what was the role of Donald Trump? What was the role of people working for him as agents of him? We don't have that, but we have an awful lot about the circumstances around it. Andrea, you want to start with that? As a reporter, I think that's where we're coming from.
And today, the House Intelligence Committee, Republican and Democrat, put out their guidelines for what they're going to be investigating. And they said very specifically, certainly Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat, said contacts, relationships between anyone connected or associated with Donald Trump and the Russians. And they didn't say Russian intelligence, they just said the Russians, because, as was pointed out, it is so difficult to define who is intelligence and who is not. And that may have been the problem with one of the pieces, the reporting. The contacts were with Russian associates that they are investigating. I met with top Democratic leaders on the Hill yesterday, and they said they are going to be pressing for this. They think the key is their efforts to try to get the tax returns. And they have ways, going back to a Teapot Dome scandal era legislation, to try to force the release by the IRS of the president's tax returns. They think that that will show what kind of investments, what kind of money, what kind of real estate purchases, what kind of connections between them and associates, the Trump organization, if not the president himself. They want to follow the money. They believe that that is real, and they are claiming that they think they can get someplace. Also, the notice from the White House counsel today to the staff to preserve documents, just today.
Telling the Trump White House.
Well, the committees told the Trump White House general counsel. The general counsel today told everyone in the White House, preserve your documents, preserve your emails. That is a red line. And when we just got a response from the White House from a senior official saying, well, that was proactively to protect us from false stories.
Okay.
Take that.
Make of it what you will. We mentioned David Remnick. We want to bring him in, editor of the New Yorker magazine. By way of telling you, before joining the New Yorker, David lived in Russia for 4 years as the Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post. He's an expert on that country, so much so he wrote a book on it. His book, Lenin's Tomb, The Last Days of the Soviet Empire, won a Pulitzer Prize. And now he has just co-bylined this exhaustive report in the New Yorker on Russia's influence over our election and about Russia's relationship with our new president. And David is here tonight to help us lay this out. I am tempted.
Means long, doesn't it?
Yeah, I joked that I took the day off yesterday and read the article. It is long, but part of this whole conversation will be urging anyone watching to read it because of the way you chose to map out the relationship. And I think I'll start this way. In broad strokes, when we all grew up, the Cold War was about then the Soviet Union and our country in ways that had us hiding under our desks in grade school, but with big ticket items, missiles with measured in things like throw weights, and it was visible, it was muscular. One of the subpoints of your article is how small ticket, how meek this may look to some people, but how incredibly effective it's been. What kind of war are they waging?
Well, it's an extension of the Cold War. I mean, in terms of tactics. And let me just start by saying this. And I thought your posing of the questions in the beginning was a very intelligent and essential thing to do, because it slows this down so that we don't get hysterical or Russophobic or...
That's in the second hour.
Exactly. But it's important to remember what we don't know, as you pointed out. Remember, the accusations, even of the hack itself, are on the level mainly of assertion. 17 intelligence agencies agree with a degree of confidence, ranging from high to mid-level confidence, that this hack occurred and that Vladimir Putin did it with a purpose, which was to undermine Hillary Clinton. Now, there are reasons for why that may be. But we should start that we want to know more. Now, it's difficult to get the evidence for this because the intelligence community doesn't want to blow its human sources or its technological sources. So as citizens and as journalists, we want to know more about not just assertion, but evidence that can be told to the public about what happened. That's number one. Why would Vladimir Putin want to do this at all? Because he despised Hillary Clinton. I think Putin probably assumed, like the rest of us, that Donald Trump was going to lose. And the motivation was much more, less to elect or try to elect Donald Trump than it was to destabilize right off the bat a Hillary Clinton presidency. Now, why would he do that? He did it, first of all, Bill Clinton is the man who moved NATO eastward toward the toward the borders of Russia. We don't think about this much. To Russians, especially someone like Vladimir Putin, that is a grave national security threat. Forget it, and it goes on and on toward Ukraine and all the rest. They also saw Hillary Clinton as an interventionist in foreign policy in the way they did not see Obama, who they didn't like very much either. So they were not enthusiastic about a Clinton presidency.
But I'm watching and I'm hearing you carefully lay out that point, and I say to myself, yeah, but what about the component of this story that we've all seen? The first presidential candidate in the modern era, or any era, the first president certainly, going out of his way to find charitable language and talk about Vladimir Putin.
It's one thing to say it would be great to have a better relationship with Russia because, by the way, it couldn't be worse. I mean, it has been worse, but it's been terrible for almost, certainly since 2000. This relationship has gotten, in fits and starts, it's been terrible. So much so that we see kind of hybrid war-like activity on the borders. We see disputes over Georgia, Ukraine, the language between the two countries, the body language, the diplomacy is awful, whether it's Syria, Ukraine, and all the rest. So the predicate there is terrible. I mean, the relationship between the two countries is alarming. And a lot of analysts and politicians and diplomats in the West feel what Putin wants is to sow discord, not just in the United States, but in France, in Holland, in Germany, so that institutions like NATO and the European Union become, if not exploded, then at least less stable than they used to be, unsure, so that the West experiences a crisis and leaves Russia the hell alone. That's what Russia wants.
The end of the Cold War was supposed to bring in an era of North against South rather than East against West. That after the Cold War was over, that we'd both see the threat from the South, Tashkent. They would see the threat from the Islamic parts in their soft underbelly, and they would have a common interest with us. Whoever was running Russia would have a common interest with the West in taking on the threat from Islamic terrorism. Why isn't Putin driven by that? Because clearly Trump wants to cut a deal like that.
He is. You remember who was the first foreign leader to call George Bush on 9/11? Vladimir Putin, which Putin advertises all the time.
Right.
He feels an enormous sense of resentment toward the West. I don't want to, be his lawyer by any stretch of the imagination.
You write so clearly on that.
This guy is an autocrat, and he has shut down dissent. And I don't want to speak from a point of moral equivalence, but it is important to understand what his motivations are in terms of diplomacy, in terms of his military moves. Why did he take Crimea? Why did he take Crimea? A lot of it was aimed at the West as well as the situation in Ukraine. The Ukraine was the bridge too far for him. The idea that the West would establish a diplomatic and economic bridgehead in a country that Putin doesn't even consider a country, he considers it part of the Russian heritage. That was a bridge too far.
Stalin was from Crimea, right?
He's from Georgia.
Was he Georgia?
Georgia.
Somebody was from Crimea. Yalta was in Crimea.
On that happy note, while we figure out where Uncle Joe was brought up,
we've got that
we're going to take our first break. When we come back, one of the reasons why, for all the talk of fake news, some people believe this administration equals the Newspaper Journalists Full Employment Act of 2017. The Washington Post is on the board with another exclusive story. We'll be back to talk about that and continue our discussion with David Remnick right after this.